The autumn leaves painted Vermont's mountains in brilliant shades of amber and crimson as Thomas Sterling adjusted the rearview mirror of their rented Honda Accord. His wife Emma sat beside him, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the passenger window. They'd been driving for 3 hours from Boston, leaving behind the chaos of their wedding reception just 2 days prior. "Are you sure this is the right turn?" Emma asked, studying the GPS on her phone with a slight frown. The signal had been spotty for the last 20 miles, and the narrow mountain road seemed to wind endlessly through dense forest. "According to the directions from Pine Ridge Rentals, we should see the sign any minute now," Thomas replied, his voice carrying that mix of excitement and nervousness that comes with new adventures. At 28, he was a software engineer who preferred the predictability of code to the uncertainty of wilderness, but Emma had convinced him that they needed something special for their honeymoon, something different from their usual city breaks. Emma, 26 and a graphic designer with an eye for beauty, had found the listing online 3 months ago. "Mountain retreat, perfect for romantic getaways," the advertisement had promised. The photo showed a rustic log cabin nestled among towering pines, complete with a stone fireplace, wraparound porch and stunning views of the Green Mountains. It looked like something from a postcard. "There," Emma pointed excitedly as a weathered wooden sign came into view, "Whispering Pines Cabin, Private Road." Thomas turned onto the gravel path, their car bouncing slightly over the uneven surface. The trees seemed to close in around them, creating a natural tunnel that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns across their windshield. After another 10 minutes of careful driving, the cabin finally appeared in a small clearing. It was exactly as advertised, a 2-story log structure with green shutters and a red metal roof. Firewood was neatly stacked along one side, and 2 wooden rocking chairs sat on the front porch, facing the magnificent mountain vista. "It's perfect," Emma breathed, already reaching for her camera to capture the moment. Thomas parked beside a small shed and killed the engine. The sudden silence was almost startling after hours of highway noise. Here, 40 miles from the nearest town of Millbrook, they could hear only the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. They retrieved their luggage from the trunk, just 2 suitcases for their planned 4-day stay. Emma had packed light, mostly comfortable clothes and her favorite books. Thomas had brought his laptop despite Emma's protests about a digital detox, and a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for their first night as a married couple in their honeymoon suite. The key was exactly where the rental company had promised, under a fake rock beside the front steps. As Thomas unlocked the heavy wooden door, Emma took one last photo of the exterior, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the clearing. Inside, the cabin exceeded their expectations. The main room featured exposed wooden beams, a massive stone fireplace already laid with kindling and logs, and large windows that framed the mountain views perfectly. The kitchen was small but well-equipped, stocked with basic supplies and a bottle of local maple syrup, with a welcome note, "Compliments of Pine Ridge Rentals. Enjoy your stay. Look at this view," Emma called from the kitchen window. The mountains stretched endlessly into the distance, their peaks already touched with the purple shadows of approaching evening. "We should call your parents and let them know we arrived safely." Thomas pulled out his phone and frowned at the display. "No signal. So I guess that's part of the authentic mountain experience they advertised." He walked around the cabin, holding his phone high, but the screen stubbornly showed no bars. "Mine's the same," Emma said, checking her own device. "Well, we did want to unplug from the world for a few days. Besides, we're not supposed to check out until Sunday. If there's an emergency, the rental company has the landline number." They spent the next hour exploring their temporary home. Upstairs, a cozy bedroom with a king-size bed offered the same spectacular views through a large dormer window. The bathroom was rustic but clean, with a clawfoot tub that Emma immediately declared perfect for a romantic soak. A small second bedroom had been converted into a reading nook with built-in bookshelves filled with classic novels and local guidebooks. As darkness began to settle over the mountains, Thomas started a fire while Emma unpacked their groceries. They'd stopped at a market in Millbrook and bought enough supplies for several days: steaks, fresh vegetables, coffee, and Emma's favorite tea. The plan was simple: relax, reconnect, and enjoy being newlyweds, away from the demands of their busy Boston lives. "To our first night as Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," Thomas said, raising his champagne glass as firelight danced across the cabin walls. "To new adventures," Emma replied, clinking her glass against his. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, causing the old cabin to creak and settle around them. It was a comforting sound, they agreed, the voice of a building that had sheltered many couples over the years. Neither of them noticed the small, almost invisible hole in the wall behind the bookshelf upstairs, or the faint red light that blinked steadily in the darkness, recording their every word and movement as they settled in for what they believed would be a perfect romantic getaway. The fire crackled warmly as Thomas and Emma finished their dinner of grilled steaks and roasted vegetables. The champagne had left them both relaxed and content, snuggled together on the worn leather couch facing the stone fireplace. Outside, the October wind had grown stronger, whistling through the pine trees and occasionally rattling the cabin's windows. "I love how quiet it is here," Emma murmured, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. "No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors playing music too loud, just us and nature." Thomas kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo. "I have to admit, you were right about this place. I was worried it might be too isolated, but it's exactly what we needed after all the wedding stress." They'd both been working overtime in the months leading up to their wedding. Thomas debugging a critical software launch, while Emma managed 3 major client campaigns simultaneously. The wedding itself had been beautiful but exhausting, with 150 guests, family drama, and countless last-minute details that had left them both running on adrenaline and caffeine. "Should we try that clawfoot tub?" Emma suggested with a mischievous smile. "I brought those lavender bath salts from the spa." "Sounds perfect," Thomas agreed, but as he stood to bank the fire, a sound from outside made them both pause. It was subtle, like footsteps on gravel, or perhaps a large animal moving through the underbrush near the cabin. They waited, listening intently, but heard only the wind and the settling of the old wooden structure around them. "Probably just a deer," Thomas said, though he found himself walking to the front window and peering out into the darkness. The porch light illuminated only a small circle around the front door, beyond which the forest was an impenetrable wall of black. "Or a bear," Emma added with a nervous laugh. "The guidebook upstairs mentioned that black bears are common in this area. The rental company left instructions about securing garbage and not leaving food outside." Thomas double-checked that the front door was locked and made sure the kitchen windows were latched. The cabin felt secure enough, with its thick log walls and heavy doors, but being this far from civilization made every unexplained sound seem more significant. Upstairs, they filled the old clawfoot tub with hot water and Emma's lavender salts. The bathroom was cozy, lit by a small window that looked out over the back of the property toward a dense grove of maple trees. As they soaked together in the warm water, the stress of the past months seemed to melt away. "We should do this more often," Emma said, trailing her fingers through the water. "Not necessarily rent cabins in the middle of nowhere, but take real breaks together. No phones, no laptops, no distractions." "Agreed," Thomas replied, though part of him still felt anxious about being so completely cut off from the outside world. In Boston, he was never more than seconds away from help if needed. Here, the nearest neighbor was probably miles away, and they had no way to call for assistance if something went wrong. After their bath, they settled into the comfortable king-size bed. Emma had brought a novel she'd been meaning to read, while Thomas, despite his earlier promises about unplugging, found himself missing the gentle glow of his laptop screen. Instead, he picked up one of the local guidebooks from the bedside table. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud by the light of the bedside lamp. "Vermont's Green Mountains have been home to logging camps, hunting lodges, and remote retreats for over 2 centuries. Many of these isolated properties have rich histories, though some have gained reputations for unusual occurrences and unexplained events." "Unusual occurrences?" Emma looked up from her book with raised eyebrows. "Like what?" Thomas continued reading. The guidebook mentions several properties where guests have reported strange sounds, mysterious lights and feelings of being watched. Local folklore attributes these experiences to the spirits of loggers and hunters who died in the harsh mountain winters. "That's just tourist nonsense," Emma said, but Thomas noticed she moved a little closer to him in the bed. "Every remote area has ghost stories. It's probably just old buildings settling and wild animals moving around outside." A sudden thump from somewhere below made them both freeze. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been moved in the main room of the cabin. "I'll go check," Thomas said, reaching for the robe hanging on the bedpost. "I'm coming with you," Emma replied quickly, not wanting to be left alone upstairs. They crept down the wooden staircase, which creaked softly under their weight. The main room was exactly as they'd left it, fire burning low in the grate, their dinner dishes still on the small dining table, champagne bottle empty beside the couch. Nothing appeared to have fallen or been disturbed. Thomas walked through the cabin systematically, checking each room and window. Everything was secure, with no signs of intrusion or disturbance. The sound remained unexplained. "Old buildings make noise," he said, trying to convince himself as much as Emma. "Especially wooden ones in changing temperatures. The fire heated up the main room and now it's cooling down outside. The wood expands and contracts." They returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Every small sound, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the pop of settling timbers, the distant hoot of an owl, seemed amplified in the mountain silence. Emma found herself staring at the bedroom window, where moonlight filtered through the pine boughs and cast moving shadows across the wall. Around midnight, she was finally drifting off when a new sound made her eyes snap open. This time, it was unmistakably the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch, slow, deliberate steps moving from one end to the other. Thomas was already awake, his body tense beside her. They lay in the darkness, holding their breath, as the footsteps continued for nearly a minute before stopping directly in front of the main door. Then, silence. Thomas slipped out of bed as quietly as possible, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Emma grabbed his wrist, her grip tight with fear, but he gently pulled away and moved toward the bedroom window. The moonlight was bright enough to illuminate the clearing around the cabin, casting everything in silver and deep shadow. He pressed his face to the glass, scanning the porch below and the tree line beyond. Nothing moved. The night was perfectly still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After several minutes of careful observation, he returned to bed, but neither of them slept for the rest of the night. Dawn came grey and overcast, with low clouds clinging to the mountain peaks. Thomas made coffee while Emma sat at the kitchen table, dark circles under her eyes. The morning light made their nighttime fears seem almost foolish, but the memory of those deliberate footsteps lingered. "Maybe we should drive into town today," Emma suggested, wrapping her hands around her warm mug. "Get some fresh air. Maybe find a place with cell service to check in with our families." "Good idea," Thomas agreed. "We could pick up some supplies. Maybe ask the locals about wildlife in the area. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for what we heard." They dressed quickly and headed outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Thomas walked around the cabin's perimeter, while Emma loaded their day pack with water and snacks. He found nothing unusual. No footprints, no disturbed ground, no signs that anyone had been near the building during the night. The drive to Millbrook took 45 minutes on the winding mountain roads. The small town was picturesque in the way that only New England villages can be, with a main street lined by colonial-era buildings housing antique shops, a general store, and a diner called Martha's Kitchen. Population 847, according to the weathered sign at the town limits. They stopped first at the general store, where an elderly man behind the counter greeted them with the cautious friendliness typical of small-town residents encountering strangers. "Hi, you folks staying up at one of the rental cabins?" he asked, noting their hiking clothes and out-of-state license plate visible through the window. "Whispering Pines," Thomas replied. "Beautiful area, very peaceful." The man's expression changed subtly, a shadow crossing his weathered features. "Oh, that place, yeah, it's quiet up there. You having a good stay?" "Mostly," Emma said. "We heard some strange sounds last night. Probably just wildlife, but we're city folks, not used to all the forest noises." The storekeeper nodded slowly, but his eyes held a curious intensity. "What kind of sounds?" Thomas and Emma exchanged glances. "Footsteps on the porch," Thomas said finally. "Around midnight. Sounded like someone walking back and forth, then stopping at the front door." The man rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Could be a black bear, I suppose. They're curious creatures, especially this time of year when they're putting on weight for winter. But bears don't usually walk like that, back and forth, regular-like." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "You know, that cabin's had a few incidents over the years. Nothing dangerous, mind you, but guests sometimes report feeling like they're being watched. Hearing things, finding small items moved around." "What kind of incidents?" Emma asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Well, there was a family from New York. Maybe 5 years back. They cut their vacation short after the first night, said they felt like someone was walking around the cabin all night, but when they looked outside, never saw anything. Another couple claimed someone had been going through their belongings while they were out hiking." The storekeeper leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Thing is, that cabin's been in the Pine Ridge rental system for over 20 years. Remote location, but usually booked solid during peak season. These past few years, though, it's had a lot of early checkouts. Bad reviews online about unusual disturbances and feeling unsafe. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. Has anyone ever actually seen who or what might be causing these disturbances? That's the thing, the man replied. Sheriff's been called out there a few times to investigate reports of prowlers or trespassers. Never found any evidence. No footprints, no signs of break-ins, nothing. Property gets checked regular by the rental company too. Always comes up clean. Emma set down the bottle of water she'd been planning to purchase. Maybe we should consider cutting our trip short, find a hotel in town for the rest of our honeymoon. Now, don't let me scare you off, the storekeeper said quickly. Could be I'm just repeating old stories. Small towns love their mysteries, and sometimes a few coincidences get blown out of proportion. Lots of people stay there without any problems at all. But as they left the store, Thomas noticed the man watching them through the window with an expression of concern. At Martha's kitchen, their waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, was more direct when they mentioned where they were staying. "You're brave souls," she said quietly, refilling their coffee cups. "I wouldn't spend a night up there if you paid me. My cousin's boy does maintenance for Pine Ridge Rentals, and he says that place gives him the creeps. Always feels like someone's watching him work, even when he's there alone." She glanced around to make sure no other customers were listening. "Between you and me, I think somebody's been using that cabin as a hideout. Someone who knows the area real well, knows when it's occupied and when it's empty. The rental schedule's not exactly secret. Half the town knows when city folks are expected." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "You think someone's been watching us?" "I think," she said carefully, "that if I were you, I'd trust my instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. There's nothing wrong with being cautious, especially when you're that far from help." They drove back to the cabin in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The mountain road seemed more ominous now, winding through dense forest that could hide anything. When they reached the clearing, everything appeared normal. The cabin sat peacefully in the afternoon sunlight, the rocking chairs on the porch moving gently in the breeze. But as Thomas turned off the engine, Emma grabbed his arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing toward the front door. There, clearly visible in the soft dirt beside the porch steps, was a single boot print that definitely hadn't been there when they left that morning. Thomas grabbed his phone to photograph the boot print, though he knew the image would be useless without cell service to send it anywhere. The print was large, size 11 or 12, with a distinctive tread pattern that looked like a hiking boot or work boot. It was pressed deep into the damp earth, suggesting someone of considerable weight. "We're leaving," Emma said firmly, her voice shaking slightly. "Right now. We'll pack our things and drive back to town." But as Thomas approached the front door, he noticed it was slightly ajar, just a crack but enough to make his blood run cold. He was absolutely certain they had locked it before leaving that morning. "Emma, stay by the car," he said quietly, pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight even though it was broad daylight. The screen's glow felt somehow comforting. "Don't go in there alone," she protested, but she remained by the Honda, her hand on the driver's side door handle, ready to flee if necessary. Thomas pushed the door open slowly. The hinges creaked softly, a sound that now seemed ominous rather than quaint. Inside, the cabin appeared exactly as they'd left it, their breakfast dishes still on the counter, Emma's book on the couch, his guidebook stacked neatly on the coffee table. He moved through each room methodically, checking closets behind furniture under the bed upstairs. Nothing was missing or obviously disturbed, but something felt wrong. The air itself seemed different, carrying an unfamiliar scent, not unpleasant, but definitely not the clean pine fragrance they'd grown accustomed to. In the upstairs bedroom, Thomas noticed that Emma's suitcase had been moved slightly, not dramatically, just a few inches to the left from where he remembered it being. When he opened it, her clothes appeared to be in the same order, but there was something too neat about the arrangement, as if someone had carefully gone through each item and then replaced everything exactly as they'd found it. "Is everything okay?" Emma called from outside, her voice tight with anxiety. "Come up here," Thomas replied, "but leave the front door open." Emma climbed the stairs reluctantly, staying close to Thomas as he showed her the suitcase. She examined her belongings carefully, her face growing pale. "My journal," she whispered. "It was under my sweaters, and now it's on top. Someone's been reading it." The journal was a leather-bound book where Emma had been recording memories from their engagement and wedding planning, personal thoughts, private moments, intimate details about their relationship that no stranger should ever see. Thomas felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. This wasn't random wildlife or old building settling. Someone had deliberately entered their temporary home, violated their privacy, and was clearly sending a message. "We're watching you." "We need to call the police," Emma said, though they both knew their phones were useless here. "The rental company gave us an emergency contact number for the landline," Thomas remembered. There was an old rotary phone on the kitchen counter, connected to a landline that the rental company maintained for emergencies. Downstairs, Thomas picked up the heavy receiver and was relieved to hear a dial tone. He called the number printed on the welcome packet, but it rang endlessly without an answer. He tried the sheriff's office number listed in the local phone book, but got the same result, endless ringing with no response. "Maybe the lines are down because of the weather," Emma suggested, though the afternoon was calm and clear. As if on cue, the phone went dead in Thomas's hand. No dial tone, no static, just silence. "That's it," Emma said decisively. "We're packing right now and getting out of here. We can drive until we find cell service and call the police from the road." They threw their belongings into their suitcases without the careful packing they'd done in Boston just 3 days earlier. Emma grabbed her toiletries from the bathroom while Thomas gathered their food from the kitchen, not wanting to leave anything behind that might suggest when they'd departed. As Emma came down the stairs with her suitcase, she stopped suddenly. "Thomas, look at this." On the coffee table, placed precisely in the center where it couldn't be missed, was a Polaroid photograph that definitely hadn't been there before. The image showed the two of them sleeping in the upstairs bed the previous night, taken from the foot of the bed. The flash had captured them clearly. Emma curled on her side, Thomas on his back with one arm across his face. "Someone was in here while we were sleeping," Emma breathed, her voice barely audible. "They were standing right there watching us, taking pictures." Thomas snatched up the photograph, his hands trembling with rage and fear. The angle suggested the photographer had been standing in the bedroom for several minutes, close enough to touch them, close enough to hurt them if that had been the intention. "Car, now," he said, grabbing both suitcases and heading for the door. But as they reached the Honda, Thomas noticed something that made his stomach drop. Both front tires were flat, slashed cleanly with what looked like a knife. They weren't going anywhere. Emma saw it at the same time and grabbed Thomas's arm. "The landline. We need to try it again. Maybe we can reach someone." They ran back inside, but the phone remained dead. Thomas examined the connection and discovered that the line had been cut, a clean slice through the cable where it entered the cabin. They were alone, 40 miles from the nearest town, with no transportation and no way to call for help. Whoever had been watching them had made sure they couldn't leave. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, Thomas and Emma huddled together on the couch, staring at the Polaroid photograph that proved their nightmare was just beginning. Outside, barely visible in the growing darkness, a figure moved between the trees, patient and methodical, watching the cabin with the focused attention of a predator studying its prey. Night fell quickly in the mountains, and with it came a suffocating sense of isolation. Thomas had barricaded the front door with the heavy dining table and checked every window lock twice. Emma sat on the couch, the Polaroid photograph in her trembling hands, trying to make sense of their situation. "Someone planned this," she said quietly. "The slashed tires, the cut phone line. They wanted us trapped here." Thomas paced the small living room, his mind racing through possibilities. The question is why? Are we random victims, or did someone specifically target us? The answer came sooner than expected. A folded piece of paper slid under the front door, despite the table barricade. Thomas grabbed it immediately, his hands shaking as he unfolded what appeared to be a printout from a computer. It was a detailed profile of their lives. Thomas Sterling, 28, software engineer at TechFlow Solutions in Boston. Emma Hartwell Sterling, 26, freelance graphic designer. Home address, work addresses, parents' names, even their wedding date and venue. At the bottom, written in red ink, was a simple message. "You have something I need." "What could we possibly have that someone wants?" Emma asked, reading over his shoulder. "We're not wealthy, we don't have access to company secrets or anything valuable." Thomas studied the paper more carefully. The information was too detailed, too accurate to be gathered by a casual observer. Someone had been researching them for weeks, possibly months. "This has to be connected to my work somehow. Maybe someone thinks I have access to client data or source code." A soft knock on the front door made them both freeze. 3 measured taps, then silence. Then 3 more taps, exactly the same rhythm. "Thomas Sterling," a voice called from outside. It was male, calm, and somehow more terrifying for its casual tone. "I know you're listening. We need to talk." Thomas motioned for Emma to stay quiet and moved closer to the door. though he made no move to remove the barricade. "I'm not here to hurt you," the voice continued, "but I do need something from you, and I'm prepared to wait as long as necessary to get it." "What do you want?" Thomas called back, trying to keep his voice steady. 3 months ago, you worked on a data migration project for Hartwell Industries. During that process, you copied certain files to a secure drive. I need that drive. Thomas's blood ran cold. Hartwell Industries was one of TechFlow's biggest clients, and the data migration had been a massive project involving years of financial records, client information, and proprietary research data. He had indeed copied files to a secure drive, but that was standard protocol for backup purposes during large migrations. Emma grabbed his arm, her face pale. "Hartwell Industries, that's my father's company." "Thomas, what files did you copy?" The voice outside continued before Thomas could answer. "Mr. Sterling, I know you're considering your options. Let me help you understand the situation. You have information that certain people will pay handsomely for. Information about government contracts, research partnerships, financial irregularities that could destroy careers and companies." Thomas felt sick. He'd performed hundreds of data migrations in his career, always following strict security protocols. He'd never looked at the actual content of the files. That wasn't his job. But now someone was suggesting that Emma's father's company had been involved in something criminal. "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas shouted through the door. "I'm a software engineer, not a corporate spy. I've never looked at confidential client data." "But you have access to it," the voice replied patiently, "and that's all I need. The secure drive is in your apartment in Boston, isn't it? In your home office, probably in the fireproof safe where you keep all your backup drives." The accuracy of that statement was chilling. Thomas did indeed keep backup drives in a fireproof safe in his home office, but how could this person know such specific details about his security practices? Emma was staring at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Thomas, what is he talking about? What kind of information could be on those drives?" Before Thomas could respond, the lights went out. The sudden darkness was absolute, not even the usual glow from the fireplace, which meant their watcher had somehow extinguished the fire as well. In the pitch black, every sound seemed amplified. Their breathing, the creaking of the old cabin, and most unsettling of all, the sound of footsteps moving around the perimeter of the building. Thomas fumbled for his phone's flashlight, its weak beam barely penetrating the darkness. Emma pressed close against him, both of them straining to listen. The footsteps were deliberate and unhurried, as if their captor was conducting a thorough inspection of the cabin's exterior. "Here's what's going to happen," the voice called out, now coming from the back of the cabin. "You're going to give me the location of that safe and the combination. In return, I'll let you both walk away from this. No one gets hurt, and you can continue your happy married life. And if we refuse," Thomas called back, though he dreaded the answer, "then you'll spend a very long time here while I convince you to change your mind. I'm a patient man, Mr. Sterling, and I have everything I need to wait you out. Food, water, warm clothes. You, on the other hand, have limited supplies and no way to call for help." The footsteps stopped directly outside the kitchen window. In the weak light from Thomas's phone, they could see a shadow moving past the glass. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what appeared to be military-style clothing and carrying a large backpack. "I'll give you until morning to think about it," the voice said. "But understand this, I know everything about you. Where you work, where your parents live, where Emma's sister goes to college. This can end easily, or it can become very complicated for everyone you care about." The footsteps moved away from the window, but Thomas and Emma knew their captor hadn't left. He was still out there, watching, waiting, controlling every aspect of their situation. Emma buried her face against Thomas's shoulder. "My father's company," she whispered. What could they have been doing that someone would go to these lengths? Thomas held her close, his mind racing through everything he knew about the Hartwell Industries project. It had been a routine data migration, or so he'd thought. But now he was beginning to wonder if he'd stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple honeymoon getaway. Outside, their captor settled in for a long night of waiting, confident that morning would bring the cooperation he needed. Dawn brought no relief, only the harsh reality of their situation in the cold mountain light. Thomas and Emma had spent the night huddled together on the couch, taking turns staying awake to watch the windows. Their captor had remained silent through the dark hours, but they'd occasionally seen the brief flicker of a cigarette lighter in the tree line, a reminder that they were still being watched. "Time's up," the voice called from outside as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the pine trees. "I trust you've had time to consider my offer. Thomas approached the barricaded door cautiously. I need to understand what this is really about. You're asking me to betray a client's trust based on vague accusations. Nothing vague about it, the voice replied. Hartwell Industries has been laundering money for a criminal organization through their government contracts, falsifying research data, inflating costs, hiding payments to offshore accounts. Your wife's father has been running a sophisticated fraud operation for over 5 years. Emma's face went white. That's impossible. My father's company does legitimate defense research. They develop communication systems for the military. They do indeed, their captor confirmed. But they also cook the books, Mr. Sterling. And the evidence is sitting in your safe in Boston, copied from their servers during your migration project. Thomas felt his world shifting. He'd always prided himself on maintaining strict ethical boundaries in his work, never accessing client data beyond what was necessary for his technical duties. But if what this man was saying was true, he'd unknowingly become a witness to federal crimes. Even if that's true, Thomas said, I can't just hand over confidential client data to a stranger. There are legal procedures, proper channels. The proper channels have been compromised, the voice interrupted. Some very powerful people have been paid to look the other way. The only way this information sees daylight is through unofficial means. And who exactly are you? Emma called out. FBI? DEA? Some kind of federal investigator? A long pause. Let's just say I'm someone with a vested interest in seeing justice done. Someone who's been tracking this operation for a very long time. Thomas felt a chill of suspicion. If you're law enforcement, show us your credentials. Come to the door where we can see you. Another pause, longer this time. I'm afraid I can't do that, Mr. Sterling. My investigation is unofficial. There are people in various agencies who would prefer that Hartwell Industries' activities remain hidden. The admission confirmed Thomas's growing suspicion that their captor wasn't a federal agent at all. You're not a cop, he said. You're trying to steal data for your own purposes. Does it matter? The voice replied with a hint of impatience. The information is valuable regardless of who wants it. I'm offering you a chance to walk away cleanly. Others might not be so generous. Emma grabbed Thomas's arm. Others? How many people know about this? More than you'd like to think, came the reply. Mr. Sterling's little data migration created quite a stir in certain circles. You're not the first people to be approached about accessing those files. Thomas felt sick. What happened to the others? Silence stretched for nearly a minute before their captor answered. They were less cooperative than I hope you'll be. The implication was clear and terrifying. Thomas and Emma exchanged looks of growing panic. They weren't dealing with a lone criminal. They were caught in the middle of something much larger and more dangerous. I need proof, Thomas said desperately. If my client really is involved in criminal activity, I need to see evidence before I'll consider betraying their trust. Fair enough, the voice replied. A few minutes later, another piece of paper slid under the door. This time it was a printout of what appeared to be financial records, bank transfers, contract modifications, and correspondence between Hartwell Industries and several overseas companies with suspicious-sounding names. Emma studied the documents with increasing horror. These are my father's signatures, she whispered, but I don't understand these transactions. Millions of dollars going to companies I've never heard of. Thomas examined the paperwork more carefully. The financial irregularities were obvious once you knew what to look for. Inflated invoices, duplicate payments, shell companies that existed only on paper. If authentic, these documents showed a pattern of systematic fraud spanning several years. This could all be fabricated, Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. Check the account numbers, their captor suggested. Cross-reference the dates with Hartwell's public contract announcements. Everything can be verified through public records if you know where to look. Thomas realized with growing dread that the man was probably right. The level of detail in these documents would be nearly impossible to fake convincingly, which meant Emma's father, a man Thomas had met only a few times, but who seemed genuinely devoted to his family and his work, was either a criminal or being framed by someone with extraordinary resources. Even if this is all true, Emma said, her voice shaking, why should we trust you? You've kidnapped us, terrorized us, and you won't even show us who you are. Because, the voice replied with cold certainty, I'm the only chance you have of getting out of this alive. There are other parties interested in those files, and they're not as patient as I am. They should be arriving sometime this afternoon. The blood drained from Thomas's face. What other parties? The people your father-in-law has been working with, Mrs. Sterling. They've discovered that their financial records were compromised during the data migration. They're coming to tie up loose ends. Emma sank onto the couch, overwhelmed by the implications. You're saying my father is involved with criminals who are coming here to kill us. I'm saying you have about 6 hours to decide whether you want to work with me or take your chances with them. And trust me, Mrs. Sterling, they won't be offering you any deals. Thomas stared out the window at the peaceful mountain scenery, his mind reeling. Their romantic honeymoon getaway had become a nightmare beyond anything they could have imagined. And if their captor was telling the truth, the worst was yet to come. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Thomas and Emma sat in tense silence, weighing impossible choices while their unknown captor remained hidden in the forest around them. The financial documents lay spread across the coffee table like pieces of a puzzle that painted an increasingly damning picture of Emma's father. I keep thinking there has to be another explanation, Emma said for the dozenth time, staring at her father's signature on a particularly suspicious contract modification. Maybe he was being blackmailed or threatened or... Emma, Thomas interrupted gently. Look at the dates. This goes back 5 years. These aren't the actions of someone being coerced. This is systematic, deliberate fraud. Emma's eyes filled with tears. The man who had walked her down the aisle just days ago, who had given a touching speech about how proud he was of her and how much he loved Thomas, was apparently living a double life as a criminal. How could I not have known? She whispered. I worked summers at his company during college. I've been to company parties, met his business partners. How could I have missed something this big? Thomas took her hand. Because you're his daughter, not a forensic accountant. He kept this part of his business completely separate from his family life. A new sound interrupted their conversation, the distant rumble of vehicles approaching on the mountain road. Thomas's stomach dropped as he realized their 6-hour deadline was up. They're early, their captor's voice called from outside, now carrying a note of urgency. Mr. Sterling, I need your decision right now. Work with me, or we're all dead. Thomas moved to the window and saw 2 black SUVs emerging from the tree line, moving slowly up the gravel road toward the cabin. Even from a distance, he could see that the vehicle's windows were tinted, and they moved with the careful precision of a military convoy. What exactly are you proposing? Thomas called back, his mouth dry with fear. I get you out of here alive, and you give me remote access to your safe when we reach civilization. I copy the files I need, and you both disappear until this blows over. And if we refuse, then we find out how merciful those gentlemen in the SUVs are feeling today. Emma stood beside Thomas at the window, watching the vehicles approach. Thomas, we don't really have a choice, do we? The lead SUV stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, just at the edge of the clearing. 4 men emerged, all wearing dark clothing and moving with military precision. One carried what appeared to be an assault rifle, while the others had handguns visible in shoulder holsters. Mr. Sterling, one of the men called out in a voice with a slight Eastern European accent, we know you're inside. We're here to discuss the data files you copied from Hartwell Industries. Thomas and Emma exchanged terrified glances. These weren't federal agents or corporate security. These were the kind of men who made problems disappear permanently. We have no interest in harming you, the man continued. We simply need to ensure that certain information doesn't fall into the wrong hands. If you cooperate, you'll be compensated generously and allowed to continue your lives. Don't trust them, their original captor's voice whispered from somewhere much closer to the cabin than before. I've seen what their compensation looks like. The man from the SUV seemed to hear the whisper as well. He gestured to his companions, who immediately began spreading out around the cabin in a tactical formation. It appears you have a friend out there, the man called. Unfortunately, this complicates matters. We'll need to speak with both of you. Gunfire erupted suddenly from the forest, rapid, controlled bursts that spoke of professional training. The men near the SUVs took cover and began returning fire toward the tree line. Thomas and Emma dropped to the floor as bullets shattered the cabin's windows, sending glass cascading across the room. "Stay down!" Thomas shouted, pulling Emma behind the couch as more shots rang out. The firefight was intense but brief, maybe 30 seconds of sustained gunfire before an eerie silence settled over the clearing. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," the accented voice called again, now sounding slightly winded. "Your friend has been neutralized. Please come outside so we can resolve this matter peacefully." Thomas risked a glance out the broken window and saw one of the gunmen dragging a body from the forest toward the cabin. Even from a distance, he could see the dark stain of blood on the man's tactical vest. Emma saw it too and covered her mouth to stifle a gasp. Their mysterious captor, whatever his real motives had been, was dead. They were alone now with men who had just committed murder with casual efficiency. "You have 60 seconds to come outside," the leader announced. "After that, we'll come in and get you. I promise you won't enjoy that experience." Thomas looked around desperately for another option. The cabin's back door led to a small deck overlooking a steep slope down to a creek. It would be dangerous in daylight, nearly suicidal in the gathering dusk, but it might be their only chance. "The back door," he whispered to Emma. "When I count to 3, we run for the tree line and don't stop until we reach the creek." Emma nodded, her face pale but determined. They crept toward the kitchen, staying below the windows as Boots approached the front porch. "Time's up," the leader called. The front door exploded inward as someone kicked it open, sending the dining table barricade sliding across the floor. "3!" Thomas shouted, and they bolted through the back door just as armed men poured into the main room. Shouts erupted behind them as they sprinted across the deck and plunged into the forest, branches tearing at their clothes as they stumbled down the steep slope toward the sound of running water below. Behind them, flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and angry voices coordinated the pursuit. Thomas and Emma ran blindly through the mountain wilderness, knowing that their survival now depended on staying ahead of professional killers who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate the only witnesses to their crimes. The forest was a nightmare of gnarled roots, fallen logs, and thorn bushes that tore at their clothes and skin as Thomas and Emma stumbled through the darkness. Behind them, powerful flashlights swept methodically through the trees, accompanied by the sound of men moving with practiced coordination through the wilderness. "This way," Thomas whispered, pulling Emma toward the sound of running water. The creek might mask their footsteps and provide a path through the dense forest. His software engineer's logical mind was working overtime, calculating angles and distances, trying to find any advantage against pursuers who were clearly trained for this kind of hunt. They reached the creek bank just as a flashlight beam swept across the spot where they'd been standing moments before. The water was shallow but ice-cold, shocking their systems as they waded in. Emma bit back a gasp as the frigid mountain water soaked through her hiking boots. "Keep moving downstream," Thomas breathed into her ear. "The water will hide our tracks and muffle the sound of our movement." They waded carefully through the rocky creek bed, trying to balance speed with stealth. The water was only knee-deep, but the current was stronger than expected, and the smooth stones beneath their feet were treacherously slippery. Emma nearly fell twice, saved only by Thomas's steadying hand. Behind them, voices called out in what sounded like coordinated search patterns. "North section clear," someone reported, moving to the creek area. Thomas felt his heart rate spike. These men weren't random criminals. They were operating with military precision, using proper communication protocols and systematic search techniques. Whatever organization Emma's father had been involved with, they had serious resources. "There," Emma whispered, pointing to a fallen tree that had created a natural bridge across the creek about 20 yards downstream. "We can get back to dry land without leaving tracks." They crawled carefully across the moss-covered trunk, Thomas going first to test its stability. The log held their weight, but it was slippery with moisture and decay. Emma was halfway across when they heard voices much closer than before. "Creek's the logical route," someone was saying in accented English. "Boris, take the east bank. Dmitri, west bank. I'll follow the water itself." Thomas helped Emma down from the log, and they pressed themselves against the far bank, hidden beneath the overhanging roots of a massive pine tree. Through the darkness, they could see flashlight beams approaching the creek from multiple directions. The leader appeared first, wading through the water with his weapon ready, flashlight scanning both banks. He was methodical and patient, checking every shadow, every possible hiding spot. Thomas held his breath as the beams swept inches from their concealment. "Sir," a voice called from upstream. "Found something." The leader turned back toward the cabin. "What is it?" "Blood trail. Looks like they cut themselves on something during the escape. Fresh blood on these thorns." Thomas looked down and realized that Emma's arm was indeed bleeding from a gash she'd sustained during their desperate flight. In the darkness and adrenaline, neither of them had noticed, but now he could see dark stains on her jacket sleeve. "Follow the blood," the leader ordered, "but stay alert. They could be setting up an ambush." The flashlights moved away from their hiding spot, but Thomas knew they'd brought only temporary safety. Professional trackers would eventually find their trail, especially with a blood sign to follow. "We need to reach the road," he whispered to Emma. "Find another vehicle, or at least get to where someone might see us. The main road is miles away, Emma replied, pressing her hand against the cut on her arm. And they'll have people watching it anyway, Thomas thought frantically. They were city people, completely out of their element in this mountain wilderness. Their pursuers were professionals with superior equipment, training, and local knowledge. In a straight chase, they had no chance. "Wait," Emma said suddenly. "There's an old logging road about a mile north of here. My father brought me camping in this area when I was a kid. The road connects to a fire tower. There might be emergency equipment there, maybe even a radio." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than wandering aimlessly through the forest. They set off through the trees, moving as quietly as possible while trying to maintain their direction. The moon provided just enough light to avoid the largest obstacles, but progress was painfully slow. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they heard the distant sound of engines starting. Their pursuers were expanding the search, probably bringing in more vehicles to cover the mountain roads. "They're not giving up," Emma observed unnecessarily. "Would you?" Thomas replied grimly. "If we make it to civilization, we become witnesses to murder and kidnapping. They can't afford to let us go." They pressed on through the darkness, guided by Emma's childhood memories of family camping trips that seemed like they'd happened in another lifetime. The forest seemed endless, full of shadows that could conceal threats and sounds that might herald discovery. Just as Thomas was beginning to wonder if they were lost, Emma grabbed his arm and pointed ahead. Through the trees, barely visible in the moonlight, was the weathered wooden structure of an old fire tower, rising above the forest canopy. "There," she whispered, "if we can get to the radio equipment." But as they approached the base of the tower, Thomas saw something that made his blood run cold. Parked beside the structure was another black SUV, and standing guard at the tower's base was a man with an assault rifle. Their pursuers had anticipated their destination and arrived first. The trap was closing, and their options were running out fast. Thomas and Emma crouched behind a fallen log, watching the guard at the fire tower. The man was alert and professional, scanning the forest methodically while maintaining radio contact with his team. Their last hope of reaching emergency communications had been eliminated. "They knew we'd come here," Emma whispered, her voice heavy with despair. "They know this area better than we do." Thomas studied their situation with growing dread. They were exhausted, injured, and completely outmatched. But as he watched the guards' patrol pattern, he noticed something that sparked a desperate idea. "The guard's radio," he murmured. "He's been checking in every few minutes. If we could get to it." "Thomas, he has an assault rifle. We can't fight these people." "We don't have to fight him," Thomas said, his mind racing through the logistics. "We just need to create a distraction long enough to get a message out." Before Emma could object, Thomas was already moving. He picked up a handful of rocks and began circling wide around the tower, staying low and using the forest for cover. When he was positioned about 50 yards from the guard's location, he hurled the rocks as far as he could in the opposite direction. The stones crashed through the underbrush with enough noise to suggest someone moving clumsily through the forest. The guard immediately turned toward the sound, speaking rapidly into his radio as he moved to investigate. Thomas sprinted toward the abandoned SUV, hoping against hope that they'd left communication equipment inside. The vehicle was unlocked, overconfidence on their part, and he found a satellite phone on the passenger seat. His fingers trembled as he dialed 911, praying the satellite connection would work in the mountains. 911, what's your emergency?" "This is Thomas Sterling," he whispered urgently. "My wife and I are being hunted by armed men in the Vermont mountains near Millbrook. We're at an old fire tower about 10 miles north of town. Multiple shooters, military-style weapons. They've already killed someone. Sir, can you repeat your location?" "Fire tower, 10 miles north of Millbrook, Vermont. Armed men in black SUVs. They're trying to kill us because of data files from Hartwell Industries. Send everything you have." The guard's voice was getting closer as he returned from investigating the distraction. Thomas ended the call and slipped back into the forest just as the man rounded the SUV. "Base, this is Tower 1, the guard reported. "False alarm on the noise, but someone's been in the vehicle. The sat phone was moved." Thomas made his way back to Emma, who had watched the entire operation with a mixture of terror and admiration. "Did you get through?" she asked. "I think so. But it'll take time for help to arrive, and they know we made contact now. They'll probably try to finish this quickly." As if summoned by his words, multiple engines roared to life in different directions around them. The hunters were converging on their position, no longer concerned with stealth. "There," Emma pointed to a rocky outcrop about 100 yards up the slope. "If we can reach those boulders, We might have some protection. They ran through the forest as vehicle lights began sweeping through the trees around them. The rocky outcrop provided decent cover, but Thomas knew it was also a potential trap. If their pursuers surrounded the position, they'd be sitting ducks. "Mr. Sterling," the familiar accented voice called from below, "we know you made a phone call. Very resourceful, but ultimately futile. Local emergency services won't reach this area for at least an hour. We'll be long gone by then." "Along with us," Emma muttered. "Not necessarily," the voice continued. "We're willing to make one final offer. Give us the location and access codes for your secure drive, and we'll leave you here for the authorities to find. You have my word." "Your word?" Thomas shouted back. "Like the word you gave our previous captor before you shot him?" A pause. "That was an unfortunate necessity, but you're civilians, not combatants. Killing you serves no purpose if we get what we came for." Thomas almost wanted to believe it, but Emma's expression reminded him that they'd witnessed murder. They were loose ends that couldn't be allowed to survive. "You have 2 minutes to decide," the voice announced. "After that, we come up and get you." Emma squeezed Thomas's hand. "Whatever happens, I love you." "Don't talk like that," Thomas replied fiercely. "We're getting out of this." But as flashlights began moving up the slope toward their position, Thomas had to face the reality that their desperate gamble might have failed. Help was coming, but probably not in time. The hunters were closing in for the final confrontation, and Thomas and Emma Sterling had nowhere left to run. Then in the distance came a sound that made Thomas's heart leap with hope, the distinctive whop 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 of helicopter rotors cutting through the mountain air. Multiple aircraft, moving fast and low through the valleys. "State Police Aviation," someone below cursed in a foreign language. "We need to abort. Now." Engines roared to life as the hunting party realized their window was closing. But in their haste to escape, they'd made a critical error. They'd forgotten about the 2 witnesses hiding in the rocks above, who now had a clear view of license plates, faces, and vehicle descriptions. As the first helicopter crested the ridge with its searchlight blazing, Thomas and Emma Sterling emerged from their rocky shelter, battered and traumatized, but alive. The nightmare was ending, but the questions it raised about Emma's father and the criminal organization he'd been involved with were just beginning. Detective Sarah Chen adjusted her hard hat as she followed the construction foreman through the gutted interior of what had once been known as Whispering Pines Cabin. The property had changed hands 6 times since the Sterling incident, each owner eventually abandoning it due to persistent rumors and an inability to attract guests willing to stay in a place associated with kidnapping and murder. "We found it during the electrical work," the foreman explained, leading her to a section of exposed wall studs. "Looks like there was a false wall here, maybe 18 inches deep. Professional construction, not something a homeowner would build." Sarah examined the hidden space with growing unease. The concealed area ran the length of the cabin's main room, accessible through a carefully camouflaged panel that had gone undetected for decades. Inside, they discovered sophisticated surveillance equipment, cameras, recording devices, and monitoring systems that were far more advanced than anything a casual voyeur would use. "How long do you think this has been here?" Sarah asked. "Based on the equipment models and installation methods, I'd say at least 20 years, maybe longer." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October mountain air. The Sterling case had been officially closed after the dramatic rescue operation 15 years ago. The surviving members of the criminal organization had been tracked down and prosecuted, though the leader with the Eastern European accent had escaped and was never found. Thomas and Emma had testified about their ordeal, providing crucial evidence that led to the exposure of Hartwell Industries' money laundering operation. But this discovery suggested something far more sinister had been happening at the cabin long before the Sterling's honeymoon nightmare. "There's more," the foreman said, leading her to a workbench where several items had been carefully laid out. "We found these hidden behind the monitoring equipment." Sarah's blood ran cold as she examined the evidence. Dozens of photographs of couples who had stayed at the cabin over the years, personal items that had clearly been stolen from guests, and most disturbing of all, a collection of audio recordings labeled with dates going back more than 2 decades. "Detective," one of the construction workers called from the upstairs bedroom, "you need to see this." Sarah climbed the narrow staircase to find the worker standing beside a section of wall where the insulation had been removed. Carved directly into the wooden beam was a message that made her stomach turn. "Couple Datra 47, Thomas and Emma Sterling, October 2010, special circumstances, target eliminated." Below it were dozens of other names and dates, a horrifying catalogue of couples who had stayed at the cabin over the years. Most entries were brief, just names and dates, but a few had additional notations that Sarah didn't want to contemplate. "We need to evacuate this site immediately," Sarah ordered, pulling out her phone. "This is now a crime scene." As the construction crew gathered their tools and left, Sarah remained alone in the cabin, studying the carved messages with growing horror. The Sterling case hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been part of a much larger operation that had been selecting and monitoring victims for years. She called her supervisor with trembling fingers. "Lieutenant, we're going to need the FBI and probably multiple state agencies. The Sterling cabin case just got a lot bigger." Within hours, the remote mountain clearing was swarming with federal agents, forensic specialists, and investigators from multiple jurisdictions. The carved names were photographed and cross-referenced with missing persons databases, revealing a pattern of disappearances that stretched back decades. Dr. Patricia Vance, the FBI's lead behavioral analyst, examined the evidence with the clinical detachment necessary for such work. "This wasn't random predation," she explained to the assembled investigators. "Someone was specifically targeting couples for extended surveillance and, in some cases, elimination. The sophistication of the monitoring equipment suggests significant financial backing." "Any theories on motive?" Sarah asked. "Could be sexual, could be financial, could be both. Some of these couples were wealthy, others weren't. The common factor seems to be that they were all isolated here for several days with no outside contact." As the investigation expanded, disturbing details emerged. The cabin's ownership history revealed a complex web of shell companies and offshore entities that made it nearly impossible to trace the true owners. The surveillance equipment had been regularly updated and maintained, suggesting an ongoing operation rather than a historical artifact. Most chilling of all, forensic analysis of the audio recordings revealed that many of the missing couples had been monitored for days before their disappearances, their private conversations and intimate moments recorded and catalogued by their unseen watchers. "The Sterling case probably saved their lives," Dr. Vance observed, reviewing the timeline of events. "If the criminal organization targeting Thomas's data files hadn't intervened when they did, the original surveillance operation might have proceeded as planned." Sarah studied the photograph of Thomas and Emma Sterling from the case files. They looked so young and happy, completely unaware that their romantic getaway had been orchestrated by predators who had been watching and selecting victims for years. "Do we contact them?" Sarah asked her supervisor. "To let them know what we found." Lieutenant Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "They deserve to know the truth, but after 15 years they've probably built new lives. This is going to reopen old trauma." The call was made on a grey November afternoon. Thomas Sterling, now 43, and a successful cybersecurity consultant, listened in stunned silence as Detective Chen explained the discovery. Emma, sitting beside him in their Boston home with their 2 children playing in the next room, gripped his hand as the full horror of their situation became clear. "So we were never random victims," Emma said finally. "Someone had been planning to hurt us long before my father's criminal associates showed up." "That's what the evidence suggests, yes," Detective Chen confirmed. "You were targeted specifically, probably weeks or months in advance. The cabin's entire rental operation appears to have been designed to identify and isolate potential victims." After ending the call, Thomas and Emma sat in their living room, holding each other as they had 15 years earlier in that mountain cabin. Their children's laughter from the next room seemed to come from another world as they processed the revelation that their survival had been even more miraculous than they'd realized. "All those other couples," Emma whispered. "How many people didn't make it home?" The investigation would continue for months, ultimately identifying 47 missing persons cases connected to the cabin over a 20-year period. Some remains were found buried in remote locations throughout the Green Mountains. Others were never recovered. The true architects of the surveillance operation were never identified, their trail lost in the labyrinth of corporate shells and offshore accounts that had funded the cabin's deadly secret. But their carefully planned system of predation had finally been exposed, brought down by the same random criminal intervention that had saved Thomas and Emma Sterling's lives. In the end, the cabin was demolished, its dark secrets buried forever. A small memorial was erected in the clearing, bearing the names of all the victims who had been identified. Thomas and Emma attended the dedication ceremony, placing flowers for the couples who hadn't been as fortunate as they were. As they drove away from the mountain clearing for the final time, Emma reached for Thomas's hand. "Do you think we'll ever really be free of this place?" Thomas looked in the rearview mirror at the memorial growing smaller behind them, then at the road ahead leading back to their life, their children, their future. "We already are," he said. "We survived when we weren't supposed to. Everything since then has been borrowed time, and we've used it well." The mountains of Vermont kept their remaining secrets, but the nightmare of Whispering Pines cabin was finally over.